Hi all! This module focuses on decision-making processes in groups. As I'm sure you know, if you've ever been in a group, there are a lot of decisions to make. Decision-making is one of the most common tasks that groups have to face, and although this is especially true for task-oriented groups like work teams and things like this, it's also true for relational groups like families, groups of friends, and so on. So decision making can be about small, relatively mundane things like what is a family going to have for dinner? Where is a group of friends going to go out for the evening? That kind of thing. But it can also involve much more complex situations where groups like a political task force or an executive board need to make decisions about complex, multifaceted, big picture issues that impact many stakeholders. So there's been a lot of research on decision making in groups, as you might imagine, given how common of a task it is. And I won't attempt to summarize all of it in this brief video, but I will talk through some of the important dimensions of effective decision making for groups and teams. So one of the first things to think about when you're faced with a decision-making task is making sure that the group really understands the problem or issue at stake. So sometimes groups just, they know they have to make a decision and they just sort of make one quickly without really understanding the nature of the problem. So one of the first things to do is to kind of analyze what's the situation, why do we have to make this decision in the first place. This means having a solid understanding of the issue, who it impacts, why it's important, thinking about, if this is a recurring problem, what's been tried before, why isn't that working, or what is working well about it, understanding what are the resources that we have to address the issues, and then importantly, thinking about for your group, what is your group's mission or values or goals, and how do those relate to the problem or the issue. So having this sort of solid information base and an understanding of the problem is a really important starting point. A second thing is working with information. And we had a previous module on like sharing information and networks and how information moves around, but information is crucial in decision making. So of course, groups want to make well-informed decisions, so analyzing the problem is part of it, but like gathering a lot of information about like what are the possible solutions, what could happen with these different solutions, what all of the different information that's at stake, various opinions, positions, perspectives on what to do in the situation. And then of course evaluating that information. So we live in a society now where there's lots of information. We have almost too much information. And so part of information gathering and using information is sorting out like what are the credible, reliable sources, what is the good, useful information that is pertinent to our task. So there's a lot of like sifting through information and analyzing it. And this could involve, in some groups, depending on what the decision is, it could involve like looking at different metrics or creating spreadsheets that sort of analyze at different financial aspects of the problem or potential solutions, right? So there's this whole aspect of like making sure you understand the problem and then getting the appropriate information. So that's only part of what groups have to deal with when they're making decisions, though, because there's also the idea that, and this is where communication studies and kind of group communication comes in pretty heavily, is there are lots of different process options. There are lots of different ways that groups can make decisions. And so part of what we want to do when we're thinking about decision-making communication is understand what is the best process for our group. So the readings in this module and the research in group communication in general provide a lot of different examples of different processes. There's things like brainstorming, which is a process that could be part of a decision-making, a larger decision-making practice. There's questions about should we generate ideas for solutions all together in a group, or is that something we should do more individually? Do we want to make decisions by consensus or voting for majority rules or ranked choice voting? How should we go about analyzing and weighing the pros and cons? All these kinds of questions about design. So part of what group scholars do is to look at what are these different design processes that groups can use to try to work through the decision process and try to maximize the benefits of making well-informed, ethical, kind of appropriate decisions, right? So when you're faced with this as a group member, it's first of all building your own knowledge about what kind of processes are available, what's out there. And then also thinking about which process is best for your group in this particular task. I've certainly been in situations where, the go-to answer is like, well, let's brainstorm, but that's not always what you need to be doing. Sometimes you need to be doing more of a deep dive and analysis, right? Or vice versa. Maybe you have a group that defaults to just like analyzing one or two solutions and not really generating new ideas, right? So thinking about what are you trying to do and what kind of processes can help you achieve that. So I find the functional perspective on group decision making particularly helpful, and that's one of the things that's talked about in the readings in this module. So this perspective highlights the importance of having clarity on what your criteria are so that you can do an appropriate evaluation, and also the importance of evaluating both the positive and negative aspects of all the options you want to consider. So these are a couple of pitfalls that groups fall into that this perspective's kind of foregrounds and says make sure you pay attention to this. So when we think about the evaluating solutions, unless groups are really vigilant about evaluating all the different solutions fairly, it's pretty easy to just seize on the first reasonable seeming solution, right? Especially if you have time pressure or anything like this. You think about like, oh, this one seems like it'll work, and you kind of give it a cursory analysis and go like, yeah, this is good. Are we all on board? Okay, we're on board, good, right? But that kind of rushed decision making where you're really only weighing the options of one, you're not even really weighing options. You're just kind of analyzing, does this one solution seem feasible? It's not very thorough, right? So in this functional perspective on group decision making, it kind of makes a point that we should evaluate all of the possible options for both positive and negative. Another sort of pitfall related to this is sometimes groups kind of have a solution that they like better or fits better with what they've done before, and so they'll evaluate like the positive sides of that and maybe the negative sides of a different solution. That's not really the same as weighing like pros and cons of each possibility, right? So that's one of the aspects of the making sure you think about the positive and negative about all the possible solutions in a rigorous way. The other thing that this perspective highlights that I think is really important is this idea of having criteria. So I talked about this a little bit earlier when I was saying, know your mission of your organization, but you want to think about like, what are the values that your solution should have, and how would you know if if your solution is going to be successful or not? Like, what are the criteria of a successful solution? And then use those criteria to help you evaluate the different proposals, right? Groups often don't do this step. They just kind of assume that everybody knows what the criteria are and just sort of, move on to sort of weighing pros and cons of options without really thinking about like, well, why are we thinking some things are more important than other things? Are all pros and cons equal, or are some things more important than others, right? So this can be problematic because if groups don't go through the step of discussing their values and criteria, then like different group members might have different criteria that they think are most important, right? And then that can sometimes cause conflict and confusion. For instance, one group member might think that the total cost is the most important factor to consider, so whatever the cheapest solution is, that's the one to go with. But another group member might think, the long-term impact is more important. So, this person might be willing to have the solution cost a little bit more if it could demonstrate that it did the best job of addressing the problem long-term and was sustainable over time, right? So unless the group talks about like which is more important, cost or sustainability, long-term impact, then it's hard to know, whose side is going to win that argument, right? But getting clarity on those values means that it's not about like my position versus somebody else's. It's about these are the things at stake, and as a group we value one more than other. Another aspect of decision making is just keeping relational dimensions in mind. We usually talk about decision making as task oriented and information and sort of, using analysis and things like this. But of course, all of those happen alongside relational communication. So you want to be doing this in a way that's supportive and has positive relationships and is mindful of sort of social influence and power. And we'll talk about some of that stuff in an upcoming module. And then finally, the last thing is evaluating the quality of your decision. So once a decision is reached, that decision making doesn't really end. It doesn't mean like you're completely finished now and you're off the hook and don't have to think about it again. Good decision making will involve kind of a feedback loop to evaluate it later. Are we still addressing the problem? How is it holding up, right? Because solutions often lead to future problems. And so there's decision making as a kind of a constant task. Now, of course, the communication processes, the specific ones involved in decision making, will vary depending on what kind of group you're in and what the context is, what techniques and technologies you're using, what your time frame is like. But these things that we've talked through so far about using information, following a good design, keeping relationships in mind, and sort of following back up and evaluating the quality of decision later, those should help you and your groups make good decisions regardless of what your group is doing. Okay, that's it for now, and I look forward to seeing your work this week.